On Flight 909 from Atlanta to London that day, the first-class cabin was as quiet as a concert of expensive suits and delicate perfumes. In seat 1A, a slim black girl, only 17 years old, sat silently with a sketchbook and headphones on. No one knew that in a few minutes. The largest international airport in the southern United States would have to stop for her. When the white flight attendant approached, the polite smile on her lips could not hide the doubt in her eyes. "Are you sure you are sitting in the right seat? This seat is first class." A light sentence, but opened a whole abyss called prejudice. And when the girl was forced to leave her seat amidst the cold gazes of the silent people, no one expected that just 10 minutes later, a black private plane would illegally land, blocking the runway, and the man who stepped out of it was her father. A moment when the whole world held its breath, just to witness justice speak in silence. If you believe that respect knows no color, please like, share this story, and subscribe to my channel to start my journey. Black teen was told to get off the plane. Moments later, her black single dad's jet blocks the runway. The Atlantic Crown Airways Boeing 787 sat motionless on the tarmac like a giant bird waiting for takeoff. Inside the first-class cabin, soft yellow light bathed the soft leather seats. The clinking of champagne glasses mixed with the piano music blaring from overhead speakers. In seat 1A, 17-year-old Liana Brooks, her curly hair tied back, was drawing in a sketchbook. She wasn't wearing designer clothes, just an old brown jacket and jeans. But there was something about her that slowed the world around her down the composure of someone who knew she belonged here, even if everyone else thought otherwise. A flight attendant approached. Catherine Doyle, about 50. Her face held taut with light makeup, her smile professional as if practiced in the mirror every morning. She stopped in front of seat 1A, looking Liana up and down, her eyes skimming over her sneakers and sketchbook as if assessing a stray object. "Are you sure you're in the right seat, sweetheart?" Her voice was sweet but firm. Liana took off her headphones, raised her head, and calmly replied, "Yes, 1A. My ticket says so." Catherine leaned over to look at her ticket and nodded. "There must be a glitch in the system. I'll double-check." She walked away, leaving behind a strong scent of perfume and a few curious glances from the other passengers. A white man in seat 1B glanced over, a vague smile on his face. Liana bent down again and continued drawing. A few minutes later, Catherine returned, her smile now translucent. "Ma'am, the system shows 2 tickets for seat 1A. There must be a mistake. I need you to move to row 27C in Economy Plus. There are still seats available." The air around Liana froze. She looked up, her eyes calm, but deep. "Excuse me, but I bought a first-class ticket. With my father's card." "Yes, I understand. But could you do me a favor? We need to keep the flight on time." "And who is the other person? The second person in 1? Catherine avoided her gaze. "I can't reveal the identity of the other passenger, but he is a titanium member of Atlantic Crown." There was a brief silence. The sound of papers turning and shoes hitting the floor could be heard in the cabin. Liana closed the notebook, her voice soft but clear. "I am also a passenger. I have the right to keep my seat." Catherine's smile disappeared. "Do you want me to call security, Ms. Brooks?" The name rang out like a cold knife. One passenger cleared his throat, another bent over his phone. No one spoke. Liana inhaled, exhaled, then stood. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She no longer looked at Catherine. "You told me to leave the plane, I will." No one stopped her. She gathered her bag and walked down the aisle. Her sneakers made a soft squeak against the leather floor, louder than any words. Confused, cold, or guilty looks followed her, but no one stood. As Liana walked through the door, Catherine turned to her coworker and said quietly, "I swear, there are too many people who think they belong here." Her coworker simply replied, "Be careful." Catherine. The name Brooks sounds familiar, but Catherine didn't care. She just wanted the flight to leave on time, like every day. Outside the jet bridge, Liana paused, pulled out her phone, and made a call. Her voice was low and strangely calm. "Dad, they told me to get off the plane, on the top floor of Helios Tower, in the middle of a tense meeting with the investment committee." Ethan Brooks looked up from the phone. He said in a low voice, "Say that again." "Liana, you were sitting in your right seat, but they said you weren't fit." In the conference room, the director stopped talking. Ethan stood up, his eyes cold and focused. He didn't ask any more questions. "Wait at the gate. Don't leave the airport." When the call ended, he said briefly to his assistant, "Ready, Falcon. Take off in 10 minutes. Outside the window, the Atlanta sky was turning copper, the last streaks of afternoon light stretching across the runways. Ethan walked out of the conference room, leaving all the numbers and graphs behind. No one dared to stop him. In their eyes, the CEO of Helios Corporation, the man who had turned a clean energy company into a global empire, had just become what he was a father. On the way to the airport, he called his general counsel, prepare a lawsuit against Atlantic Crown Airways, charge racial discrimination in passenger service. I want it all out in the open. The attorney was silent for a few seconds on the other end of the line. "What are you going to do?" Ethan looked out the window at the sunset over the city. "If they want to make trouble, I'll teach them a hard lesson. Meanwhile, Flight 909 closed." Catherine breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was all over. But out there, a dark figure was sliding across the Atlanta sky, the Helios Falcon, a Gulfstream G-Cent with a matte black body that reflected the sun like a streak of steel. "On the control tower," a voice said. "Falcon Helios, 07. This is air traffic control. You are not scheduled to land on runway 8R. Please confirm." On the other end, the pilot's voice was calm. "We will land and hold position until the personnel issue on Flight 909 is resolved." At the same time, in the first-class cabin of Flight 909, Catherine was pouring coffee for the passengers when the intercom rang out Captain Due to an emergency. "Flight 909 will be temporarily suspended from takeoff. Please remain seated." Catherine looked up, stunned. Through the window, she saw on the opposite runway a black private jet parked in the middle of the runway, blocking the entire takeoff lane. Lights flashed. Security cars drove by. Sirens blared. Then, in a flash of red and blue light, the jet door opened. A man in a black suit stepped out. No one recognized him right away, but within seconds, a murmur spread through the cabin. "Oh my God, that's Ethan Brooks, Helios Corporation." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The last name Brooks now she remembered, and in that moment, the story ceases to be about a girl being forced from her chair. It becomes a test of an entire system of power, pride, and the silent advance of justice. In the first-class cabin, Catherine Doyle stood straight, adjusting her scarf. She tried to act casual, but her hand shook slightly as she held the serving tray. In her head, Catherine told herself, "I just followed the procedure. Nothing more." The phrase, familiar as a shield, was used to erase the slight feeling of guilt in her heart. A white passenger sitting in row 2A asked softly, "What just happened?" Catherine smiled. A mechanical smile. "It's just a system error, sir. We'll be departing shortly." "She looks nice." "Yes, but not everyone knows where they are." "Right?" she replied softly, then turned away. But there was something in the eyes of a young flight attendant standing nearby that made his heart clench. He said nothing, just looked out the window, where the sunset reflected on the runway. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Liana was still standing by the glass door, clutching her ticket tightly. She wasn't crying. Her face was calm, but her eyes had something very deep, as if she was recording every moment in her memory, to redraw it later. A ground staff member approached. Her voice reserved, "Miss Brooks, we apologize for the inconvenience." The flight attendant reported a system error regarding the seating. "A system error," Liana interrupted, her voice even and low. "If it was really an error, why was I the only one to leave my seat?" The employee was silent. He bowed his head and repeated the same familiar sentence. "I was just following instructions. In the cabin." Catherine turned back to check the passenger list. Everything on the screen matched seat 1A, named Liana Brooks, ticket paid for with Helios Corporation corporate account. Nothing wrong. But instead of admitting the error, she pressed report issue and made an intercom call. "Yes, I would like to verify passenger 1A. She seems wrong. Send confirmation urgently." When she put the phone down, Catherine checked herself in the cabin mirror, adjusting her lipstick. She wasn't being mean. First class, in her mind, simply wasn't for someone like Liana. The loudspeaker blared, "Flight 909, prepare for takeoff. The cabin door will close in 3 minutes." A male passenger sitting in row 1B turned to ask, "So where is that girl?" Catherine quickly replied, "She has been transferred to Economy Plus, seat 27C. The man nodded slightly, his eyes unclear whether he agreed or avoided her. Outside the jet bridge, Liana stood still, ticket in hand. She heard the announcement on the loudspeaker that her flight was about to depart, but she did not move. In her head, her father's voice echoed, "When someone looks down on you, don't yell. Just keep your back straight." Because anger makes a person right at that moment, but wisdom makes a person right forever. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. A call. "Dad, they're closing." "Okay, wait there." His voice was as calm as a lake. No need to argue. "In the cabin." Catherine checked her watch, then pressed the button to call the captain. "Captain Pierce, the seating issue has been resolved. You may close the door." From the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Understood." The door closed. There was a soft click, as if the gates of justice had been temporarily closed. The plane taxied slowly down the runway. Catherine exhaled, thinking it was all over. But as she looked out the small window, she saw a strange light at the end of the runway, 2 streaks of white light cutting through the fading dusk. She frowned and tilted her head. A black private jet was landing in the opposite direction. The emblem on the tail was a golden circle, the logo of Helios Corporation. A chill ran down her spine. The commercial plane slowed suddenly. The siren sounded, and the passengers began to murmur. Catherine received orders over the radio. "Stay where you are. There is an emergency on the runway." She looked out the window again, and this time she saw clearly a man in a black suit stepping out of a Gulfstream G700. He walked between the rows of security cars, his eyes unwavering. Catherine's breath caught. The name Brooks suddenly felt metallic in her head. In the cabin. The passenger sitting in seat 1B looked through the window and said softly, "It's him, Ethan Brooks." Several others looked up. A woman said softly, "Helios Corporation. They call him the man who touched the sun." Catherine did not respond. Her entire face was stiff. In that moment, everyone understood this story was not over. A small mistake, seemingly just normal procedure, had just sparked something much bigger, something no system could extinguish with an apology. And when that black jet blocked the runway, not only was a flight stopped, but the whole little world of prejudice began to shake. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. In first class, no one spoke. The whine of the engine, the faint hum of the air conditioning, all seemed to drown everyone in a heavy silence. Catherine Doyle stood still, her eyes still glued to the window, trying to convince herself that this was just a coincidence. But deep down, she knew this was no longer in her control. Outside, the black jet stood motionless, a full stop in the middle of the runway. The Helios emblem on the fuselage reflected the airport lights, shining brightly against the falling night. It was more than just a plane. It was a wordless declaration of power and fatherhood. In the cabin, Liana remained seated in seat 27C, her face expressionless. She had accepted the request to move to a lower cabin just to avoid the noise. But there was no sign of submission in her eyes. When another flight attendant brought her a glass of water, she only said softly, "Thank you." Then she opened her sketchbook and slowly drew lines. Little did she know, at that very moment, her father would land at the same airport. And what happened next would make the whole world look at her in a different light. Catherine moved closer, standing in front of row 27. She smiled, a forced smile. "Are you comfortable here? When the plane takes off, I'll try to find you a seat closer to the aisle." Liana looked up. Her eyes were calm, but colder than ever. "You told me to leave the plane, and I will." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the sound of the engine. A few passengers turned. Catherine, flustered, tried to whisper, "You don't have to do that. No need." Liana stood up. She put down her pen, closed her notebook, and adjusted the strap of her backpack. "I don't sit lower just to make someone feel more comfortable." She was stunned, not because of the sharpness of her words, but because of the way she said them so calmly that it was embarrassing. Liana walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing slowly in the silent cabin. Everyone she passed looked at her, but no one said anything. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked at her with confusion. Guilt hung in the air, but not enough to make anyone stand up. An elderly woman sitting in the fourth row gently held her husband's hand, as if she wanted to say something, but then stopped. A young man looked down, pretending to look at his phone. Their silence was a mirror of society where people easily look away when injustice does not touch them. Catherine called out hoarsely, "You don't have to leave. We can work it out." Liana didn't turn around. She just said loud enough for everyone to hear, "No, you're right. My place is definitely not here." The cabin door opened. She stepped onto the jet bridge, where a blast of cold air rushed in from outside. The sound of the wind through the steel frame was the sound of freedom, light and sharp. Her steps were slow, but steady. An airport employee stood at the end of the corridor, awkwardly greeting her. "Miss Brooks, can I help you?" She smiled slightly. "No need. I just need to go outside." The door closed behind her, and at the same time, the cabin warning lights changed. A signal from air traffic control sounded. Flight 909 turned back. The passengers began to stir. Catherine looked at the captain in confusion. "What's going on?" Captain Pierce frowned. "Control said there's an emergency violation on the runway. A private jet is blocking the middle of 8R. No takeoffs at this time." She turned to the window, and in the orange light of the airport she saw it, the Helios Falcon, and the man who had just stepped out of it. When she recognized that face, everything inside Catherine collapsed. Ethan Brooks, CEO of Helios Corporation. The last name Brooks that she had said with that cold voice now echoed in her head like a judgment. Outside, Liana stood by the window, watching through the thick glass as her father walked straight through the line of security cars. He didn't say anything, didn't shout, didn't threaten. He just walked, slowly, surely, as if each step was a declaration. She felt something in her chest, not joy, nor fear, just a sense of recognition. After all, but deep in her eyes, there was something bigger, the understanding that true justice was never about revenge. She knew her father wouldn't destroy them. He would let the system collapse on its own, the way light shatters darkness without a sound. As she left the waiting area, the ground staff member was still standing there, looking through the glass. He suddenly understood that he had just witnessed the beginning of something big. Not just a case of discrimination, but the moment a young woman turned an insult into the first step of a journey to justice, in the most silent and powerful way. At the end of the hallway, Liana stopped and looked out the window again. She saw her father's silhouette small among the flickering lights, but towering over everyone, and she smiled. A smile that was enough to erase all fear, all hurt, because from that moment on, she was no longer a victim. She was the one who chose to stand up with her own calm. She turned away, her shoulders square, her silhouette blending into the blue light of the airport. Outside, the storm was brewing, but inside her, there was only a calm lake. The tide had turned, even before anyone realized it, and it would soon be understood that when a person maintains his dignity in the face of insult, he has already begun to win, even before justice is pronounced. Because sometimes, leaving your seat with honor is the only way to reclaim your true seat in the heart of this world. She stepped forward. The doors closed automatically, and in the distance, the low roar of a Helios Falcon jet engine, a warning that all silence has its limits. Justice, this time, is taking flight. But when Ethan Brooks walked down the runway, his eyes cold and his voice deep as steel, it was clear that this was no longer a fight for position, but a costly lesson for an entire industry. An hour before the Helios Falcon landed, on the 68th floor of Helios Tower, Atlanta's tallest glass building, Ethan Brooks sat in a conference room surrounded by clear glass. The afternoon sun reflected off the walnut table, casting a cold glow. On the screens in front of him, the chief financial officers were presenting their quarterly reports. Everything was perfect until his phone rang. The caller ID flashed on the screen. Liana. He smiled slightly. His daughter rarely called during meetings unless absolutely necessary. "Excuse me. We'll have to pause for a few minutes," he said calmly. Ethan picked up the phone, still smiling, but after a few seconds of listening, the smile disappeared. His voice was low, slow but cold. "Tell me again." On the other end of the line, Liana's voice was eerily calm. "They told me not to sit there. Dad. Then they kicked me off the plane." "Did you do anything?" "No. I just sat in the seat I bought." There was a heavy silence. In the conference room, the directors looked at each other, clearly sensing that something had changed. Ethan said nothing more, just stood up. The light from the glass door fell on his face, cold, sharp, and absolutely calm. "The meeting is adjourned," he said briefly, then walked out of the room, the door closing silently behind him. Outside in the hallway, his personal assistant, Michael Green, hurried after him. "What's the matter?" "Mr. Brooks." Ethan simply replied, "Ready, Falcon. Fuel is full. We're leaving for the airport." Michael was momentarily stunned. "Do we need to notify security?" "No need." He stopped in the middle of the hallway, looking out at the distant sky. "Just need them to clear the runway." As he walked through the Helios Energy Operations building, dozens of employees stopped and looked up. They had never seen Ethan Brooks look like that. Not angry, just dangerously quiet. In the private elevator, he pulled out his phone and dialed another number. "Richard, I need you to prepare a lawsuit against Atlantic Crown Airways. Reason racial discrimination in passenger service. Send a temporary notice to the media. Just one line. Helios will not cooperate with any organization that violates human dignity." The head lawyer's voice faltered. "Sir, do we need to verify more details before—" "No need," Ethan interrupted. "I trust the girl. As for the details, they will prove it themselves when it's too late." The elevator stopped at the ground floor. He stepped out without saying another word. 2 bodyguards stood on either side, quickly following behind, but he raised his hand to signal. "No need for anyone to accompany me." The Helios executive was waiting. The driver opened the door, but Ethan didn't get in right away. He stood still for a few seconds, looking up at the darkening sky. The afternoon light reflected off the glass of Helios Tower, reflecting his own face, a man accustomed to power, now faced with a father's anger. On the way to the airport, his phone rang incessantly. Advisors, partners, even the media. But he turned them all off. The only sound in the car was the electric motor and steady breathing. Michael sat in the front seat and turned around. "Do you want me to arrange for a media team to accompany you?" "This doesn't need cameras. It needs to be quiet and effective." 30 minutes later, the car stopped right in front of the private area of Atlanta International Airport. The pilot of the Helios Falcon, Captain Lewis, was waiting. "Sir, the Falcon is ready. Runway 8R can be opened if needed." Ethan nodded and walked up the stairs. Inside, the interior was finished in matte black and bronze, every detail exuding precision. He sat down in the leather seat and buckled his seatbelt. No one dared ask any questions. As the pilot revved the engines, Ethan flipped open his phone again. Liana's number was still on the screen. He dialed back. Her voice came back small, but steady, Dad. "Where are you?" "I'm at gate C-22. They're clearing the plane for takeoff." "It's okay." His voice was calm, each word heavy as lead. "They're not going anywhere." "What are you going to do?" "Teach them a lesson, but not with words." Ethan looked out the window, where the yellow lights cast a yellow glow on the runway. His eyes were cold, but deep like the sea before a storm. "If they want to cause trouble," he said slowly, "I'll teach them a hard lesson." The Falcon began to roll. Its engines roared softly, its propellers swirling in the thick night air. Air traffic control came over the radio. "Falcon Helios 7, please confirm bearing." The pilot replied stiffly. "No bearing. We only need 8R, the dispatcher asked again. "Confused 8R is for Flight 909, Atlantic Crown Airways." "Yes," Captain Lewis said, eyes still straight ahead. "That is the problem." Ethan closed his eyes. In his mind, he saw Liana walking down the aisle, her gaze calm among the silent backs of those who turned away. He didn't have to imagine how she had maintained her dignity, and he knew, this time, he couldn't let that silence be forgotten. "Fly," he ordered hoarsely. The Helios Falcon soars over Atlanta, leaving the city lights fading in its wake. In the sky, there are no limits to justice, only space for those who dare to stop the world. As the Falcon began to descend, Ethan opened his eyes. Below, "Runway, R was lit." A voice came over the radio. "Falcon Helios 7. You are not allowed to land in this area. Please return to the holding line." Captain Lewis looked at him through the rearview mirror. Ethan just nodded. "Just land." The moment the plane's wheels touched the ground, the sound of metal hitting plastic rang out like a drumbeat. The Helios Falcon skidded down the runway, stopping in the center, blocking the nose of Flight 909, which was awaiting takeoff clearance from the cockpit. Ethan looked out the window. The giant Atlantic Crown plane stopped just a few hundred meters away. He said nothing, but in his eyes, everything was decided. Across the first-class cabin, Catherine Doyle turned to the captain, her face pale. "Oh, my God," she whispered. "That's the Helios Falcon." The captain looked up, his gaze serious, and the person who just got off it was Ethan Brooks. No further words were needed. The cabin fell silent. Outside, the man was walking through the flashing lights, through the night wind of the international runway. Every step he took was a statement. No shouting, no anger, just walking and bringing the system to a halt. And when the Helios Falcon blocked the international runway, everything that was once considered airline rules suddenly became the stage for the greatest lesson in pride, dignity, and justice. Runway 8R at Atlanta International Airport had never been so quiet. All activity had stopped. The blinking pilot lights reflected off the matte black fuselage of the Helios Falcon. In the control tower, dispatchers looked at each other, not believing what was happening before their eyes. A voice cut through the radio, clear and calm to the point of being chilling. "This is Helios Falcon. We will hold position until the personnel issue on Flight 909 is resolved." At that moment, everyone in the control center turned their heads to look at the radar screen. A small bright spot, coded Falcon H7, was blocking the entire runway, blocking all takeoff activities. "Oh my God," a coordinator whispered. "He's actually blocking the international airport." On the ground, security vehicles poured out. Red and blue lights streaked across the wet asphalt, but no one dared get too close. Everyone knew whose jet it was. In the cockpit of the Helios Falcon. Ethan Brooks sat still, his eyes fixed on the distance, where the Boeing 787, Flight 909, was stopped in the middle of the runway, its lights flashing like a creature caught off guard in midair. He said nothing. There was no anger in his eyes, just a cold determination, like someone staring a mistake in the face and forcing it to correct itself. Pilot Captain Lewis turned his head and asked in a low voice, "Do you want me to contact air traffic control?" Ethan replied, still looking forward. "They will call. Hold position." In that moment, Atlanta, the noisy, industrial, bright city, suddenly became small. One man, one plane, and his love for a girl was enough to bring the entire system to a halt. Far away, in the first-class cabin of Flight 909, Catherine Doyle couldn't take her eyes off the window. Her lips were dry, and her hand trembled as she held the radio. "Captain," she whispered, "he's blocking our runway." Captain Ronald Pierce, who had been in the airline business for more than 30 years, nodded. "I know. So, What do we do? Wait. From the cockpit. His voice rang out over the intercom. Dear passengers, due to an unforeseen emergency, the flight will be temporarily suspended. Please remain seated. A murmur ran through the cabin. A middle-aged man exclaimed, What's going on? Who has the power to bring the entire airport to a halt? Another replied, his voice low but clear, The man who just stepped off the black jet is Ethan Brooks. Catherine's heart sank at the name. Now every word she had said to the young black girl echoed in her head, her voice, her attitude, the way she had looked at her like she was out of place. It all reverberated, heavy as cold iron. Through the small window, she saw the figure of that man, Ethan, walking between the security cars. The night wind whipped at his black vest, but his gait was still straight, step by step, calm and purposeful. Up in the control tower, the security chief exclaimed. He's heading straight for Flight 909. Is no one stopping him? A young officer replied quietly. No one dares. The airport's internal communications began to heat up. Every line mentioned incident at runway 8R. In the international terminal, passengers were glued to screens that showed blurry images from surveillance cameras, a black jet, a black man approaching the giant commercial Boeing. A female security guard standing behind the fence watched the scene and whispered, I have never seen anyone so calm, while challenging the entire system. Ethan's voice came on the radio, not loud, but clear. This is Ethan Brooks, CEO of Helios Corporation. I am requesting a representative of Atlantic Crown Airways to be present at Flight 909 immediately. Once my daughter has received a public apology, we will be leaving the runway. Until then, no planes in Atlanta will leave the ground. Silence fell over the control tower. A dispatcher turned and stammered, Sir, he can't do that. Can he? It's a serious violation of aviation regulations. The head of security replied dryly. None of us want to be the one to tell him that. In first class. Catherine sat down, her hands tightening around her scarf. A cold wind crept through the door, making her shiver. This, she knew, was beyond her control. It was no longer about seating, or procedure, or false politeness. It was the result of a misreading a moment of prejudice that now brought the system to a halt. Ethan stood not far from the Boeing. His face was hard and defined under the yellow light. He didn't need to speak. The entire airport was listening in silence, in the waiting area. Liana looked out the window, saw her father in the middle of the security cars. She knew he wouldn't let this go. But what moved her wasn't his power. It was how he used it. Not to destroy, but to force the world to stop and see what it had tried to ignore. She put her hand on the glass, her eyes softening against the red and green lights of the runway. Her father's silhouette appeared clearly, alone, but glowing. Ethan looked up at the cockpit of Flight 909. His eyes met those of Captain Ronald Pierce through the thick glass. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. The captain turned off the navigation lights and ordered softly, "Get the plane back to the gate, now." As Flight 909 began its turn, the entire airport held its breath. Ethan just stood there, watching. It happened exactly as he had predicted. No violence, no threats, just fatherly steadfastness and honor. On the radio, the female operator's voice rang out softly, carrying a hint of respect. Falcon Helios, this is air traffic control. Flight 909 is returning to Gate B-17 as requested by you. Captain Lewis looked at Ethan and asked softly, "What do we do next?" Sir Ethan replied, his voice low and soft. "Wait for her." He finished speaking, sat down, and looked out the window. The Falcon stood there, no longer a symbol of money or power, but a declaration of fatherly love, of the dignity of black people who were insulted but did not bow. That night, Atlanta witnessed something unprecedented. The busiest international airport in the southern United States was brought to a halt because one man refused to be silent in the face of injustice. And in that silence, justice began to speak. And when Flight 909 was forced to turn back to the gate, those who had once stood at the top suddenly realized sometimes just one father standing still in the middle of the runway is enough to make an empire bow. On runway 8R, the Boeing 787 rotated slowly. The lights reflected off the bright white fuselage of Atlantic Crown Airways, flickering in the Atlanta night. The engine hummed steadily, no longer powerful, but muffled. No one in the cabin spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know what to say to what they had just witnessed. A man, black, who, by his mere presence, had stopped hundreds of tons of steel. Catherine Doyle stood near the compartment door, her hands still clutching the clipboard until they were white. Her eyes were fixed on the information screen. The words appeared coldly. Return to Gate B-17, priority override. She read them twice, then whispered, "No way." Captain Ronald Pierce looked over, his voice calm but heavy. "We just received a direct order from air traffic control. They are requesting a return to the gate, under special direction from Helios Aviation Authority." Catherine backed away slightly, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Helios," she repeated, her voice hoarse. A passenger behind her, a man sitting in seat 1B, looked at her and whispered, "Don't you know Brooks? Ethan Brooks. That girl is his daughter." The words dropped like a stone to a still pond. Catherine spun around. "Whose daughter? Ethan Brooks's Helios Corporation." Everything inside her froze. She had heard that name hundreds of times on television, the founder of Helios, the man who put American solar technology on the global map, the black man once known as the Quiet Power. And now she remembered the girl's face, the calm eyes, the slight smile when she was asked to leave her seat, and the words, "You tell me to leave the plane, I will." In that moment, Catherine felt it clearly she had done the irreversible. The plane slowed down and turned back toward the terminal. From the windows, passengers saw the Helios Falcon jet still standing in the middle of the runway, its lights reflecting off its matte black paint like a mirror, a symbol of silent power. The captain took a deep breath and turned to Catherine. "Prepare to make the announcement. We're going back to Gate B-17, and be prepared. Someone will want to talk to you." Catherine didn't reply. She just nodded, her lips trembling slightly. All the memories from that morning flashed through her mind. The way she looked at Liana as she entered. The way she said, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The way she smiled at the white passenger while doubting the black girl because of her old coat. Everything now became an accusation. The captain's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Dear passengers, due to an unforeseen situation, the flight will be returning to Gate B-17. We apologize for the inconvenience." No one responded. Some nodded slightly, some looked down, silently. Perhaps they understood, and felt ashamed of their silence. In the middle row, a middle-aged woman wiped away tears with a handkerchief. She whispered to the person next to her, "I saw that girl. She just sat there. And what did we do?" The Boeing approached the terminal. Outside, the lights were flashing. The words Gate B-17 were lit up as a final reminder of the mistake. Catherine stood by the cabin door, her heart pounding. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. In her 20-plus years as a flight attendant, she'd dealt with aggressive passengers, drunk passengers, powerful passengers, but she'd never been as scared as she was right now. Not because Ethan Brooks could cost her her job, but because deep down, she knew she'd hurt a girl simply because of the color of her skin. When the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt light turned off, Catherine managed to find her voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are back at the gate. Please remain seated until further notice." Her voice choked. A man in business class whispered, "You don't need to announce anything else." They stopped the whole airport just to wait for you to say that. She didn't answer. She just bowed her head slightly, her hand still clutching the clipboard. Through the glass door, she saw Liana standing far away, near the reception area, the light reflecting off her face. No longer weak or vulnerable, only a terrifying calm. And right next to her was Ethan Brooks, tall, in a black suit, eyes as still as deep water. He didn't need to shout, just standing there. All the rules were reversed. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. A security team stepped forward, unhurried but clearly purposeful. One whispered to Catherine, "Mrs. Doyle, Mr. Brooks requests your presence at the jet bridge." She nodded, her legs feeling weak. As she stepped out of the cabin, she felt hundreds of eyes on her. Some looked pityingly, some judgingly silent. Each step seemed to drag on forever. When she reached the end of the hallway, she found Ethan standing there, saying nothing, just watching. Liana stood beside him, still holding the sketchbook. The yellow light from the lamp reflected off her face, as soft as a smile, but there was no anger in it, just the pride of someone who knew she was right. In that moment, Catherine wanted to say something, an apology, a justification, anything, but her throat was tight. Words were useless. Captain Ronald Pierce stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Mr. Brooks, I take full responsibility for this flight." Ethan looked at him, nodding slightly. "I know. But this is about more than just the flight. It's about how people are seen or are seen in what everyone thinks is fair air." He paused for a second, his eyes flicking to Catherine. "We'll talk here. No need to go to the office." The cold wind from the tarmac blew the passenger manifests from Catherine's hands. She watched them drift away light, disoriented, like her own pride. In that moment, she understood. Justice does not come with a scream, but with a silence that makes it impossible to escape. And she was standing in the center of that silence. Behind them, passengers were still looking out the windows. They heard nothing, but they knew. The history of an airline had just taken a different turn. One small mistake, one ill-considered decision, turned into a moment of no return. And Catherine Doyle, who once believed she was just following the process, is now living proof that prejudice has a price. The Falcon stood there, motionless, as a reminder there are lines that cannot be crossed without consequence. And that night, the entire Atlanta airport learned that from one father and one girl who could only leave her seat with honor. And when Ethan Brooks stepped onto the jet bridge, with all eyes on him, he wasn't looking for an apology. He was here to force the system to see the truth. The cabin door opened, and a cold wind rushed in from the tarmac. Security vehicle headlights lit the space, and in the light, Ethan Brooks stepped down. He took his time. Each step was steady, slow, and measured as if the ground itself were giving way. His black suit was neat, but it wasn't that caught people's attention. It was his eyes, cold, calm, and not threatening. One look, and one knew no one here had the power to stop him, Airport police cars lined up on both sides. The doors opened, and several officers got out, their hands on their radios, but no one stepped forward. One of them, the security chief, whispered into the radio, "This is Ethan Brooks, CEO of Helios Corporation." "Don't touch him," a superior voice replied. "We'll observe. No interference." Ethan continued walking between the flashing lights, the roar of the Helios Falcon's engines echoing behind him. He passed a large warning sign, "Restricted area, no entry," but no one dared to warn him. As he approached the Atlantic-crowned Boeing 787, the air seemed to thicken. Passengers in the cabin looked out the windows and saw the man walking through the night, silent but powerful, like a general without troops but stopping the entire army. Captain Ronald Pierce stood in the cockpit, looking down. Beside him, Catherine Doyle whispered, almost breathless, "He is coming." Ethan stopped a few meters from the nose of the plane, under the reflected light. His face was sharp as a knife. He didn't get angry, didn't need to speak loudly, just opened his phone, dialed a short number. A deep voice came over the control system Helios Falcon to control runway 8R. "All flights are suspended. This airport will not reopen until my daughter receives a public apology." Up in the control tower, the head of air traffic control put his hand to his earpiece, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He looked at his colleague and asked quietly, "Did he just say, 'This airport will reopen when my daughter gets an apology'?" The other man simply replied, "Yes. And I think we should listen." The wind was blowing hard below the runway. Warnings were blaring from the loudspeakers in the distance, but Ethan remained still. His hands were lightly in his pockets, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the silent Boeing in front of him. An airport police car approached, stopping at a safe distance. The commanding officer stepped out, his figure large, but his voice cautious. "Mr. Brooks, please leave the runway area. This is a military-controlled area. You do not have the authority." Ethan turned his head, his gaze stopping the other in mid-sentence. "Do you have children?" he asked, his voice low. The officer blinked, nodded. "Yes. Sir." "So if one day your daughter was kicked out of the seat she deserved just because of the color of her skin, would you stand by?" The officer was silent. No one answered. Ethan looked straight at him and said slowly, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to remind them justice has no class." Having said that, he turned around and continued walking. His gait was strangely calm, but each step he took seemed to hammer at the system's arrogance. On the stairs of Flight 909, Captain Ronald Pierce stepped out, his face tense. He stood straight, waiting. As Ethan approached, the two men, a veteran pilot and a black billionaire, stared at each other for several long seconds. Finally, it was Ronald who spoke first. "Mr. Brooks, I have no excuses." Ethan looked at him, nodding slightly. "I know, but I don't want excuses." He tilted his head, his gaze shifting over Ronald's shoulder to where Catherine stood inside the hatch, her face pale. "I want the truth out in the open, here, now." Ronald was silent for a few seconds, then motioned for Catherine to step forward. She walked slowly, her hands shaking. As the runway light illuminated her face, Catherine saw herself reflected in the man's eyes, a look that wasn't angry, but made her want to bow her head. Ethan didn't move any closer. He just asked, his voice cold and calm, "Why did you remove my daughter from her seat?" Catherine tried to speak. I thought there was a mistake in the ticket." "No." He interrupted. You thought a 17-year-old black girl couldn't sit in first class." No one said anything. Only the wind whistled through the airport lights, followed by a heavy silence. Ethan took a step forward, standing directly in front of her. "I don't need you to apologize. I need you to understand that that look is why my son must learn to leave with honor instead of staying where he deserves to be." Catherine bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. She started to say, "I'm sorry," but he held up a hand to stop her. "No, don't tell me. Tell her, in front of everyone." He turned back to look at the gate, where Liana stood in the yellow light. She approached slowly, each step light but steady. The wind blew her hair, painting a picture of a young girl with a calm demeanor, approaching the chaos without fear. As the two of them stood side by side, Ethan just nodded slightly. "Now, you can speak." Catherine could no longer stand up straight. She turned to Liana, her voice trembling. "Miss Brooks, I was wrong. Not because of the ticket, but because I didn't see you as a human being. I'm sorry." Liana didn't reply. She just nodded slightly, then said softly, her voice so soft you had to strain to hear it, "I don't need you to be ashamed. I just need you to remember, people aren't judged by the color of their skin, but by how they treat those less fortunate." Everyone standing around, security officers, airport staff, even passengers in the cabin, were silent. A simple moment, but it made the entire airport seem to stop again. Ethan looked at his daughter, then around. "Thanks. Now we can reopen the runway." He turned and walked away. No one dared to say anything. No one dared to stop him. Even the security chief stood at attention and saluted. The Helios Falcon turned on its beacon. Runway IR gradually reopened. No more red warning lights. But in the minds of those watching, something else still burned. The light of silent justice, of a father who stopped the world just to protect the dignity of his daughter. On the control screen, Flight 9 Show 9 signal changed to hold, then slowly returned to ready. And in the corner, the Helios Falcon icon disappeared from the radar as if it had never landed, leaving only a mark sometimes. Silence is enough to change the sky. And when Catherine bowed to Liana under the runway lights, no one applauded, no one cheered, but everyone understood. Justice had just walked between them, in the shape of a father and a girl who refused to bow. The air on the jet bridge, the corridor connecting the plane to the terminal, was thick as fog before a storm. The fluorescent lights reflected off the cold metal floor, casting a pale glow that made every movement starkly obvious. Ethan Brooks stood in the narrow space, the light from the runway slanting over his shoulder, casting a long shadow on the floor. Catherine Doyle, pale-faced, stood opposite, eyes downcast, still clutching the passenger screening board like a useless talisman. Around them, a circle of onlookers, stood Captain Ronald Pierce, 2 airport security officers, and the few remaining passengers. No one spoke. No one moved. They understood that this was no longer an internal affair of the airline. This was a moment when society had to face itself. Ethan spoke first, his voice low and calm, more frightening than when he was angry. "Miss Doyle," he said, his eyes still fixed on the same spot. "Do you know why I am standing here?" Catherine swallowed, her voice breaking. I was just following procedure, Mr. Brooks." Ethan smiled slightly, a smile, devoid of joy. "Procedure," he repeated, slowly, as if savoring each word. What procedure requires an agent to check a ticket 3 times just because the passenger is a black woman wearing a plain coat? No one answered. The wind from the runway blew in through the crack in the door, making the aluminum blinds flutter. Ethan took a step forward, his voice deeper. "Why do you doubt my daughter's ticket, Catherine? Because of her name, because of seat 1A, or because of her skin color?" Catherine looked up. For the first time, she looked him straight in the eyes and saw not anger in them, but a mirror reflecting her own actions. Everything she wanted to say was choked. Her voice trembled. "I didn't mean to discriminate. It's just, I don't think she's like the people who usually sit in that position." The words fell to the floor like broken glass. No one breathed. One of the guards looked away, avoiding Ethan's eyes. He didn't speak right away. He just looked at her for a few seconds, then turned to Captain Ronald Pierce. "So that's the standard on the Atlantic Crown, Captain, that passengers have to be like everyone else to be respected." Ronald took a deep breath. The man with more than 30 years in the business bowed his head. His shoulders slumped. "Mr. Brooks," he said slowly, "Miss Doyle made a mistake. As captain, I take full responsibility." Ethan was silent. He didn't need to hear excuses. He just looked into Catherine's eyes and saw no arrogance in them, only the fear of someone who had just realized she had reached a line she should never have crossed. Ronald turned back, his voice firm and decisive. "Miss Doyle, from this moment on, you are suspended from work. I will report to the board of directors. You may leave the plane." Catherine stood still, her hand hanging limply, the board falling to the floor with a dry clatter. No one applauded. No one felt sorry. Everyone just watched and learned. Ethan let out a small breath, then turned to Ronald. "Captain Pierce, I respect the way you handled it, but I need you to remember this: firing one person doesn't change a system." Ronald nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. "I understand. We will investigate the matter thoroughly." Ethan looked around, his eyes scanning the silent faces. "I don't need an apology," he said, each word falling slowly. "I need to change." His voice was low, but it echoed in the narrow space of the jet bridge, touching each person. The security guard stood up straighter. An elderly woman passenger nodded silently, tears welling in her eyes. As for Catherine, she bowed her head deeply, as if understanding for the first time the weight of an action. Ethan turned to his daughter. Liana stood there, silent. She looked at her father with a mixture of pride and gratitude, but also a sense of calm. She stepped forward and gently touched his hand. "Dad, that's enough," she whispered. "People have seen." Ethan nodded slightly. The word, though small, sounded like a bell ending the judgment. He turned away, but before leaving the jet bridge, he added, not to Catherine, but to everyone standing there: justice does not come from anger. It comes when people dare to look at their mistakes without hiding. Today, I am not protecting my daughter from anyone. I am only forcing you to see what you have become accustomed to ignoring. Then he took Liana's hand and walked away. They walked against the light, a man in a black suit, a young woman in a gray coat. Their figures fused together like an image of calm after a storm. Behind her, Catherine stood silently watching. She knew, with tears in her eyes, her life had just changed direction. But more importantly, she understood sometimes the truth doesn't scream. It just stands still and shames us with its silence. The jet bridge doors opened, letting in light from the runway. A night of justice, no gavel, no court, no sentence, just two men, a father. A son brought the system to its knees. And as they walked, everyone in the compartment continued to look on. No one said anything. But in each of them, something had changed. A little awareness, a little remorse, and perhaps a little hope. And as the jet bridge doors closed behind them, no one knew that very night, a quiet change in the entire aviation industry had begun. Outside, the Atlanta night wind still blew, carrying the echoes of what had just happened, a sound invisible, but pervasive as a reminder that justice sometimes begins with one slow but steady step. Liana Brooks stood beside her father on the steps of the Helios Falcon. The runway lights reflected off her face, her eyes clear and calm. Ethan turned to her, his voice soft from the tension. "You can fly with me. The Falcon is ready. We're leaving. We don't need to stay with them." Liana looked at her father's private plane luxury, safety and ease. But she shook her head slightly. "No, Dad, I want to go back to my seat." Ethan paused. He looked at his daughter and saw in her eyes something more than pride, a belief in herself. "Are you sure?" he asked. Liana smiled, small but firm. "I fought to make others see you as worthy. Now you have to sit down, so they see you don't need anyone's permission to do that." Ethan was silent for a few seconds. Then he nodded, a smile appearing on his face low, proud and restrained. "Okay, take your place. Liana." She turned and walked toward the Boeing 787 still parked at Gate B-17. The runway had reopened, but the air was still thick. Everyone in the cabin knew what had happened. The news spread like wildfire, and now every glance out the window was filled with silent anticipation. As her figure appeared at the end of the bridge, a low murmur arose. A few men cleared their throats. A few women bowed slightly. No one smiled. No one spoke. All fell silent as Liana stepped forward. Captain Ronald Pierce stood at the door of the compartment, adjusting his hat, his voice low but respectful. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks." Liana nodded and replied softly, "Thank you, Captain." She walked slowly down the narrow aisle. Each step was very soft, but everyone in the compartment could hear it clearly. Everyone watched her, not out of curiosity, but because they were witnessing something rare, a girl who did not turn away after being insulted, but returned to take back her rightful place. When she reached the first row, seat 1A was still empty. The yellow light from the cabin shone on the leather seat, reflecting off it faintly as if it was waiting for her. Liana put her small backpack on the floor and sat down, not in a hurry, not bowing her head. She opened her sketchbook, the old pencil still on the unfinished page, the half-face of the sleeping old woman she had drawn before it all began. An elderly male passenger sitting in seat 1B leaned slightly, his voice low and sincere. "Welcome back, young lady." Liana smiled, saying nothing. She plugged in her headphones and turned on the jazz she had been listening to. The sounds in the cabin merged with her steady breathing, as if the world had come back into place. She looked out the window. In the distance, the Helios Falcon was slowly taxiing off the runway. In that moment, Liana knew her father was watching, not to interfere, but to see her complete the rest of her story in her own way. The atmosphere in the cabin changed dramatically. The new flight attendant, a young Latina, walked up and said softly, "Would you like some lemonade, Miss Brooks?" Liana smiled and replied in a light voice, "Yes, thank you. And just call me Liana." In the middle row, a middle-aged couple looked at each other. The husband whispered, "That girl has the same demeanor as her father." The wife nodded slightly. "It's not power, it's dignity." That sentence, though small, resonated in the hearts of many people. Someone who once thought he understood what superior meant suddenly realized that there was something even higher than power, the calmness of someone who knew he had nothing to prove. As the plane began to taxi, the cabin lights dimmed. The loudspeaker announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cleared for takeoff." Everyone was silent, but in that moment, they weren't just waiting for the plane to take off. They were waiting for a new symbol to take off, a symbol of self-respect. Liana looked out the window. The runway stretched out, its lights twinkling like tiny stars on the ground. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. No more fear, no more hurt, just peace, because she knew that true victory lay not in leaving, but in returning and sitting down in her rightful place. The Boeing screeched forward, lifting off the ground. Below, the Falcon was already moving away, its taillights flashing once, a silent greeting from a father to his daughter. As the plane rose into the air, Liana opened her notebook and turned to a new page. She began to draw not someone else's sad face this time, but a vast sky, with a small plane flying high, steady, free. She smiled. Below the drawing, she wrote in neat handwriting, "Sometimes all you have to do is sit back where you belong." The first-class cabin was quiet. Everyone returned to their work, but something had changed. No one dared to talk about the appearance of a first-class passenger anymore, because tonight, everyone had seen it. Dignity doesn't need a leather chair or a glass of wine. It just needs a girl who knows she doesn't need anyone's permission to be respected. In the distance, above the clouds, the moonlight shone down on the first-class cabin. Seat 1A gleamed in the silver light, like a small but mighty symbol, a symbol of justice that needed no noise. And as Flight 909 soared through the night, no one knew that, from that first-class cabin, a surreptitious photograph of Liana Brooks would be snapped across America, sparking the year's biggest conversation about respect and dignity. That photo taken in the soft light of first class, where the 17-year-old black girl sat serenely in seat 1A, headphones in, sketchbook in hand, went viral like a quiet but persistent fire. No caption needed, no narrative needed. All people knew was this: the girl, who had been kicked out of her seat, had returned to sit in the same spot silently, but freely. 3 days later, the whole country was talking about Liana Brooks. Television news was broadcast. Newspapers were writing articles. Other airlines rushed to issue statements condemning discrimination. Atlantic Crown Airways, the center of the storm, tried to stay silent. But that silence became the clearest confession. And on the top floor of Helios Tower, a man watched silently through a giant glass window overlooking the lit-up Atlanta cityscape. Ethan Brooks wasn't angry. He was as calm as someone setting up a chess game whose final moves were already decided. On the table were a series of files, financial charts, and a copy of the official complaint to the FAA. Federal Aviation Administration. Richard Hall, Helios's chief lawyer, made a brief presentation. "We have enough evidence, ground crew recordings, passenger statements, and airport camera footage. If we sue, Atlantic Crown will have no way back." Ethan nodded. "They don't have to lose everything. They just have to learn one thing." "And what is that?" Sir Richard asked. "That respect is not a privilege. It's a duty." The next day, Helios Corporation filed a lawsuit accusing Atlantic Crown Airways of systemic racism and civil rights violations. The press exploded. CNN launched a special report: Black billionaire Ethan Brooks sues the nation's largest airline after daughter was kicked out of first class. Social media was flooded with comments, and within a week, Atlantic Crown's stock price fell 20%. Investors panicked, and the board of Sky North Holdings, the parent company, called an emergency meeting. Meanwhile, Ethan remained calm. He did not give interviews, did not appear on television, did not publish articles. He simply said one sentence to the Wall Street Journal: "Justice is not for show. It just needs to be done." But behind closed doors, Ethan began another move. Helios Capital, his investment fund, quietly bought shares in SkyNorth Holdings through intermediaries in Europe and Singapore. Each day, the pieces began to come together. 3 months later, Ethan Brooks became the largest individual shareholder in SkyNorth, the conglomerate that owns Atlantic Crown Airways. That spring shareholder meeting was a day the airline industry will never forget. SkyNorth executives huddled in the main conference room in London, worried about the stock's free fall and the lingering public opinion. The door opened. Ethan walked in. No one spoke. A cold-eyed black man in a black suit and gray tie walked slowly to the chairman's desk. SkyNorth's chairman, Mr. Walter Hemsworth, old and white, stood up to greet him, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Brooks, we didn't expect you to be here." Ethan smiled slightly. "You invited the largest shareholder of the group. I just came to exercise my rights." The room was silent. A few eyes were bewildered. A few tried to hide their confusion. Ethan opened the file, his voice steady. "For 40 years, SkyNorth has built an empire on top-notch service, but no one has asked who is that top-notch for. I'm not here to destroy Atlantic Crown. I'm here to rebuild it." He laid out a document titled Helios Standard, DEI Program for the Next Generation. It included diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all employees, from pilots to management. The conditions: he would only stay in a supervisory role, but Atlantic Crown's current CEO would have to step down. 10 minutes later, the board agreed. Atlantic Crown's CEO submitted his resignation, and Ethan was appointed honorary chairman of the Helios Standard Program. The meeting ended in silence. But outside, the international media exploded. The Financial Times headline read, "The father once seen as a troublemaker, now in charge of reshaping entire European and U.S. airline industries." But Ethan wasn't looking for fame. He just stood by the window of SkyNorth's office, looking out at rainy London, and called Liana. "Did you see the news?" he asked. Her voice was soft and calm. "I saw it. I won." Ethan chuckled. "No, Liana, I didn't win. We just reopened a door that people tried to close for too long." In the months that followed, the Helios Standard was implemented not only at Atlantic Crown, but also at many other airlines. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground staff began to be retrained in how to look, how to listen, and how to respect others, not out of fear of losing their jobs, but out of a realization that they had contributed to the silence of injustice. On the wall of the new Atlantic Crown's conference room hangs a simple sign, "Respect above the clouds." Below it is a photo, a young woman sitting in seat 1A, looking out the window. The following year, as SkyNorth shares recovered, Ethan received congratulations from hundreds of people, but he responded with one sentence in an interview with The Guardian: "I don't punish them. I just help them learn to behave like human beings again." And since then, people have called this event by a simple but profound name: the Seat 1A reform. No one remembers the noisy lawsuit. People only remember that one day. A father, without needing to get angry, made an entire industry bow its head and relearn 2 words: respect. The sky that year was still blue as every year, but for many people, it was clearer, as if justice had flown up, along with flight number 909. But as Helios Standard became a global icon, Liana, the girl who once just wanted to sit in seat 1A, chose a different path, where she turned the memories of that day's runway into immortal art. A year passed. Atlanta was entering a new autumn. The sky was high and clear, and the red trees along Peachtree Avenue were like an unfinished painting. In the mirror in the lobby of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, Liana Brooks looked at herself, her hair tied back. Her eyes the same, only her posture was steadier. The 17-year-old is now 18 on her way to London for her first exhibition, a show of paintings inspired by the story of the previous year. When the check-in staff handed over her ticket and passport, she smiled. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks. Seat 1A is ready for you." Liana nodded slightly. It was a simple statement, but it made her heart sink. A year ago, right from that seat 1A, it all began, a confrontation, an awakening, and a legacy of dignity. She boarded Flight 909, the same journey from Atlanta to London Gatwick. But now, everything was different. The first-class cabin is brighter, larger, and quieter. On the wall, a new slogan is emblazoned in silver letters, "Respect above the clouds." Not just a marketing slogan, but a manifesto written with the tears, wisdom, and courage of a young girl. The new chief stewardess, a brown-skinned woman in her early 30s, approached, smiling brightly. "Welcome aboard, Miss Brooks. It's an honor having you with us." Liana replied in a soft voice. "Thank you. It's good to be back." The stewardess said nothing more, but her eyes spoke louder than words. It was not just respect, but gratitude for the man who had changed her industry forever. She sat down in seat 1A, her hand gently stroking the seat as if touching a memory. The scent in the cabin was no longer the cold scent of new leather like before. Now, it was warm and gentle, sandalwood mixed with a hint of bergamot, the scent of peace. The scent of victory washed away from bitterness. As the plane started, Liana looked out the window. Runway 8R appeared in the afternoon sun, where the Helios Falcon had blocked a year ago. She remembered her father in a black suit, walking in the wind and light. The scene was still imprinted in her mind, like a slow-motion film, both majestic and still. Now, it's all gone. But the echoes remain, in her, in this airline, and in all the people who witnessed it. A middle-aged passenger in the back row approached, holding the airline magazine. On the cover was a picture of Ethan Brooks at the Helios Standard signing ceremony with the headline, "The Man Who Turned Justice into Corporate Culture." He smiled. "Your father is a remarkable man, Miss Brooks." Liana tilted her head slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Yes. He was the one who taught me that justice doesn't need to be shouted." He nodded, his eyes filled with deep respect. The plane took off. As the plane lifted off the ground, Liana opened her sketchbook, the one she had brought with her the year before, with the unfinished page. She continued drawing this time a scene of the plane flying through the clouds, the ground shrinking below, a symbol of the journey beyond prejudice. Beside her, an Asian girl of about 10 looked curious. "You draw so well. Are you an artist?" Liana smiled. "You could call me that. I only draw things that I can't forget." "So what did you draw today?" she asked. Liana looked up at the window, her voice low. "I drew the silence of justice." The little girl giggled, perhaps not understanding, but her mother, a woman sitting nearby, looked moved. She held her daughter's hand tighter and whispered, "Remember that." In the middle of the first-class cabin, the air softened. Everything was quiet, but not empty, because in that quiet, one could feel the real change, something that did not need to be announced, but only needed to be lived, seen, acknowledged. When the plane reached a stable altitude, the flight attendant brought Liana a glass of lemonade. On the rim of the glass was a small piece of paper printed with the airline's new logo and the words, "Thank you for helping us rise higher." She looked at the words for a long time, then smiled, not because of gratitude, but because she knew, finally, someone understood. A year ago. The smell in the cabin was the smell of temporary freedom, a conditional freedom, a freedom limited by prejudice. Today, the atmosphere was different. It was the smell of victory, but a victory in which no one lost, a victory of awareness, of change, of self-respect that spread like waves. She looked out the window, where white clouds drifted beneath her wings. In the distance, the horizon stretched out, endless, like the future. She said softly, almost whispering to herself, "Dad, I finally flew without having to prove anything, and somewhere in the endless void, it seemed, a gentle wind answered, 'You never needed to prove anything. Liana, you just needed to be yourself.'" The plane continued its journey to London, carrying not just a girl, but a symbol. Seat 1A, once the starting point of a tragedy, now became the invisible seat of the honor of human dignity. And though no one said it, everyone who walked through the first-class doors felt the same thing. No more fear of being judged, no more suspicious looks, just one thing permeating the air, respect. But when the plane touched down in London, a new chapter opened, where Liana turned that pain into art, so that the world would never forget justice can be silent, but never disappear. 3 years later, winter in New York. The wind blew through the snow-covered streets, bringing a chill that seeped into every window. But inside the Gallimore Art Gallery, amid warm yellow lights, people were witnessing an opening unlike any exhibition before. Exhibition name, Fearless. Artist Liana Brooks. No longer the 17-year-old girl trembling with the plane ticket years ago. Liana has now become one of the most talked about young faces in the New York art world, not because she is black, but because she paints with memory, with truth, and with dignity. In the main room, the lights were dimmed, leaving only a halo of light illuminating a large painting that took up the entire front wall. The painting's title, Runway 8R. The painting depicts a night in Atlanta, a matte black Helios Falcon blocking the runway, between two intersecting white and yellow lights. The dominant colors are black, white, and gray, like the three colors of reality power, prejudice, and silence. But through the center of the painting runs a streak of bright yellow, like a lightning bolt cutting across the sky, symbolizing pride, freedom, and the light of justice. The auditorium was dead silent. No one said anything. No one dared to breathe loudly. A reporter for the New Yorker whispered, "She doesn't just paint events. She makes people feel them." Ethan Brooks stood silently in the corner. He was not wearing a suit, just a gray sweater, and he held a cold cup of coffee. He looked at the painting for a long time, not like a collector, but like a father looking back at his most painful moment, resolved by art. The curator of the exhibition, Andrew Keller, a businessman who had been a passenger on Flight 909 that year, stepped up to him. "You know," Andrew said softly, "at first, I didn't believe she would dare to show that scene. But when the painting was done, I understood. She didn't paint it to get revenge. She painted it to forgive." Ethan nodded slightly. "Yes," he said slowly. "Forgiveness is not forgetting, but teaching the world to see things correctly." In the middle of the crowd, Liana appeared. She wore a long cream-colored robe, her hair tied back, her eyes bright but no longer angry. As she approached the painting, everyone stepped back, forming a small circle. She paused, placing her hand on the frame, where a small metal inscription read, "To the ones who stood silent, may you learn to speak through your conscience." Her voice rang out softly. "Without the need for a microphone 3 years ago, I learned that one person's silence can change the world, but only if that silence is turned into action." She looked around, her eyes stopping on her father today. "I don't want people to remember Flight 909 as a tragedy. I want it to be remembered as the moment when justice found its voice, not in a scream, but in light." The applause was slow, then rising, but Ethan stood still, his eyes sparkling. He knew his daughter had gone further than he thought, not just past prejudice, but past anger, turning her hurt into a legacy. A female reporter approached Liana and asked, "Why is yellow in the center of the painting? Why not red, the color of resistance, or blue, the color of hope?" Liana smiled, "Because gold is the color of light passing through metal. It only appears when it is touched. I like to remind you that sometimes it is the touch that makes people more transparent, brighter, and more real." At that moment, a group of art students standing near the window turned to each other. One of them whispered, "She doesn't just paint. She teaches us how to look at ourselves." The exhibition continues with other paintings: Gate B17, The Seat 1A, Silence over Runway. Each a slice of the same story, but seen from a different angle. Some paintings show just a father's hands holding his daughters in the light. Others show just a streak of white smoke against a gray sky. No explanation, no caption, just emotion, so pure and real it leaves one speechless. When the exhibition ended, Ethan walked over to his daughter. "You did what I couldn't," he said. Liana turned to him, her voice soft as a breath. "I stopped the world for you. You just kept it going." Outside, it had begun to snow. The yellow light from the gallery reflected off the road where a snowplow had passed, leaving 2 parallel white lines behind it. Ethan took one last look at the painting before leaving. In his eyes, the black jet was no longer a symbol of defiance. It was an image of love, of a generation that chose wisdom over anger, and of a girl who turned an insult into a lesson for all mankind. That night, as New York lit up, the Runway 8R painting went viral on social media. People no longer called Liana the victim of yesteryear. They called her the girl who painted silence. And somewhere, in the midst of the bustling crowd, a gray-haired woman sweeping the gallery floor, Catherine Doyle, the former receptionist, paused for a long time before the central painting. She said nothing. She just wiped the glass frame with trembling hands. Tears fell, reflecting golden light on the painting. They were no longer tears of guilt, but of awakening. In that silence, justice rang out again, not with the bang of a hammer, but with the soft click of a broom on the floor. But when the lights in the gallery went out, the people who had been silent in the face of injustice that year began to seek redress, and the quietest journey of redemption began, not in the courtroom, but in their own consciences. The next morning, Ethan Brooks sat by the window in a small cafe near Central Park, his espresso still steaming. He kept up his habit of reading the paper, not for the news, but to hear the breath of the world through each printed line. On the front page of the New York Times is an article about Liana Brooks' exhibition Fearless. The photo of Runway 8R takes up half the page. Below the article is a comment by someone signing A.K. Andrew Keller. Ethan paused. The name reminded him of something. Andrew Keller, the tech entrepreneur who had sat in row 2C on Flight 909 that year. The one who had watched Liana get kicked out of her seat but said nothing. The one who had looked at her with pity, then looked away. 3 years on, He writes now. I have not forgotten the look in her eyes. I kept quiet when I should have spoken. Her exhibition has made me realize that silence is also a choice, and sometimes it is the most cowardly. That afternoon, Andrew Keller arrived at Helios Tower. The tall gray-haired man in a navy jacket no longer had the confidence of a tech CEO. He carried a thick envelope, not to sign a contract, but to ask for permission to say something he had never said. When he entered the glass office on the 50th floor, he saw Ethan standing by the large windows, the sunset reflecting off the glass. "Mr. Brooks," Andrew said, his voice a little hoarse. "I am not here for business. I am here to apologize." Ethan turned back, calm as if he had expected it. "Sorry about Flight 909. Andrew nodded. "Yes, I was sitting just a few rows away from your daughter. I saw it all. I heard it all. But I kept quiet. I told myself, she must have done something wrong. Biao today, when I saw her exhibition, I realized it was me who was wrong." He placed the envelope on the table. "Here is a proposal for a partnership between my company and the Helios Foundation. I want to fund an educational project, not to make amends, but to start doing the right thing." Ethan sat down and opened the envelope. Inside was a draft of a program called Horizon Scholarship, a scholarship for disadvantaged youth, especially those who have experienced racial discrimination in the education system. Ethan read it over, then looked up. "You know, I don't believe in regret." "I know," Andrew said firmly, "but I don't need you to believe me. I just need to do this, even if no one remembers my name." The room was silent for a few seconds. The late afternoon sunlight slanted in, reflecting off the gleaming wooden tabletop. Ethan propped himself up on his hands, then slowly said, "I will agree, but on one condition." Andrew looked up, his eyes filled with excitement. Ethan continued, "You won't just be funding it, you'll be running it. You'll be going into schools and talking to kids who think they have no future, and you'll tell them that sometimes silence can hurt as much as a punch." Andrew paused, his eyes darkening. Then he nodded slightly. "Okay, I will do it." Ethan smiled, rare and gentle. "Good, because making amends with words is easiest. Making amends with actions, that is the first step of being human." From that day on, Horizon Scholarship was officially born. Andrew Keller sold a portion of his company shares and donated all the money to the foundation. He began to visit high schools in Atlanta, Detroit, and Newark, places that had been forgotten on the map of American education. In each meeting, he did not lecture, did not make promises. He simply told his story about Flight 909, about the girl who was kicked off her seat, and about the torment of a man who had been silent for too long. A student named Jamal Reed, 16, wrote in his scholarship essay after the talk, "I don't want to be a victim. I want to be a bridge builder, like Mr. Keller." Since then, the phrase bridge builder has become the symbol of the program. The first year, Horizon Scholarship awarded scholarships to 50 students. The second year, that number tripled, and at the first graduation ceremony, when the students received their diplomas, Andrew stood next to Ethan and Liana. On stage, Liana said, 3 years ago, I thought justice was when the wrong person was punished. Today, I understand that true justice is when people realize they were wrong and start to correct it with their hearts." The audience rose to their feet, applause thundering. Andrew bowed his head, tears falling into his hands. He was no longer the silent man of yesteryear. He was a bridge builder, a bridge between past and future, between error and awakening. After the ceremony, as everyone was leaving, Ethan put his hand on Andrew's shoulder. You know what he said. I used to be angry with you, but today I no longer see you as an accomplice. You chose to stand on the right side, albeit late. Andrew looked out into the windy yard, his voice choked up. I just hope these kids never have to learn that lesson the way I did. The two men stood in silence, watching the young students throw their caps into the air. Amidst the atmosphere, Liana smiled. She drew the scene with the small pencil she carried. On her page, 3 figures appeared, a girl, a father, and a once silent man now reaching out to help others cross the chasm. Below the sketch, she wrote 4 words, "Silence rebuilt bridges." The 3 of them looked at each other. No need to say anything more. They knew the most important thing was no longer who was right, who was wrong, but who had the courage to change. Outside, the sunset fell on the red brick buildings of the academy. The last rays of sunlight shone through the bronze plaque engraved with the program name Horizon Scholarship, where mistakes become bridges. And as the first bridges are built from repentance and kindness, an unexpected letter to Liana opens the final chapter, where past, present, and future meet in a belated thank you. The letter had no email, no fancy letterhead, just an old, clumsily sealed envelope with a shaky handwriting. The sender's name in the upper left corner, Catherine Doyle. Liana opened the letter in her small office in Soho. In the quiet afternoon, the paper smelled of dust and soap. The handwriting was slanted, slow. I don't know if you remember me. I was the stewardess on that flight that year, the one who kicked you off your seat. I was kicked out of the airline industry. I don't blame anyone. I just thought it was the price I deserved to pay. But what I didn't expect was fate would take me to the very place where I couldn't escape my mistakes. For the past 3 years, Catherine Doyle has lived a completely different life. After being fired from Atlantic Crown Airways, she has been unable to apply for another job at any other airline. Blacklist is something that is unspoken in the industry, but understood by everyone. Her savings were running low. Her ex-husband had long since left, and her daughter was studying far away. Catherine applied for a job as a janitor at the Gallimore Art Gallery, a place she never thought she would ever set foot in. The first day she walked in, she saw a large sign that read Fearless Exhibition, Art by Liana Brooks. Her hand shook, and the broom fell to the floor. The curator thought she was just tired, not knowing that the wind of the past was blowing into the woman's heart. Every night from then on, Catherine cleaned the main gallery where Runway 8R hung. She couldn't avoid looking at it, even when she turned away. The jet's matte black against the gray background, it was an image she would never forget. Once, she had ordered a girl off the plane. Now, every night, she bent down to clean the floor beneath her painting. No one scolded her. No one mentioned the past. But in that silence, she heard the most judgmental voice, the voice of her own conscience. One night, after closing time, Catherine stopped in front of the painting. The yellow light cast a streak of bright yellow paint through the black and white. The light seemed alive, as if it were looking at her. She spoke softly, almost in a whisper. "Liana Brooks, I thought you were just a little girl trying to be strong. But now I see. You don't have to be anything. You've been what I was never brave enough to be." Tears fell to the floor, mixing with the mop water. She sat down, her back against the wall, looking at the painting as if talking to someone in her memories. In her letter to Liana, Catherine continued, "Every night I clean that room, and I see myself in shades of gray, not white, not black, just hovering between the two sides of right and wrong. But now I know, when people dare to face their mistakes, that gray can also become the color of awakening. When she read this, Liana was silent for a long time. She remembered Catherine's face that year, her hard eyes, her cold smile. But now, in those lines, there was no longer arrogance, only truth. She folded the letter and placed it on the table, next to the old photo frame of her and her father. Ethan walked in and asked softly, "Who is this letter from?" Liana replied softly, "From the past." He looked at his daughter, knowing what she meant. "Are you going to answer no?" She replied, "No need." I think she got her answer every night when she looked at that picture. Ethan nodded slightly. Sometimes the most exquisite punishment is having to live with your own memories, until they no longer hurt, but brighten. A week later, Catherine was quietly mopping the floor in the gallery as usual. But that night something was different on the table. Near the door was a small envelope, with no return address. Just 2 words, "Thank you." Inside was a handwritten card. "Thank you for staying, for not running away from the place that once hurt you. There are people who cannot change the past, but they can keep the present clean. And that, sometimes, is also a way to make amends." Catherine didn't cry. She just placed her hand on the card and nodded. That night, she mopped the floor more slowly than usual, pausing for a long time in front of Runway 8R, then used a soft cloth to wipe the glass frame with careful, gentle movements, as if caring for a sacred relic. When the last light in the room was turned off, leaving only the yellow light from the street shining through the glass windows, the painting still glowed strangely. The yellow streak between the 2 gray patches seemed to say what no one else needed to say, that true repentance does not come from fear, but from daring to stay and face one's own shadow. Catherine stepped out of the room and closed the door. Her broom echoed down the long hallway, no longer heavy, but serene. She was no longer Catherine Doyle, the arrogant stewardess. Now, she was just an ordinary woman, learning to clean a place that had once been tarnished by her own actions. Outside, New York is transforming into spring. The trees are beginning to bud, as if even mistakes can blossom, if only people are humble enough to look back. And in the silence of that exhibition room, the stories of people who seem never to intersect weaved their final meaning, where justice, self-respect, and love became one, closing the journey with the light of awakening. Months after the Fearless exhibition, a prestigious magazine wrote, "A questionable ticket shook the airline industry. It may sound like an exaggeration, but those who know the story understand. It all really started with a small action, with a glance and a seemingly harmless question. Are you sure you're sitting in the right seat?" Just one sentence, but it is enough to reveal a system of deep-rooted prejudice. Not loud, not fierce, just lurking in the way people look at each other, in the selective smiles, in the discriminatory concern, in the politeness that is never extended to everyone. When Liana was asked to leave her seat, many people on the flight believed they were just maintaining order. They kept quiet, thinking they were not involved in the wrongdoing. But it was that silence that created the moment that the whole society would later look back on. And when the Helios Falcon blocked the runway that day, justice wasn't a scream or a retaliation. It was a systemic pause, forcing everyone from passengers to pilots to airline executives to ask themselves, am I serving humanity, or am I serving prejudice in the years that followed? Liana Brooks's name appeared not only in art magazines, but also in airline training curricula. The Helios Standard Program, initiated by Ethan Brooks himself, became the new standard for DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in the global service industry. Before, we just learned to smile at customers. One African American executive said at an international conference in Geneva, "Now, we learn to really see them." Liana sat in the audience, listening to those words, neither laughing nor crying. She only felt one thing: the change did not come from anger, but from daring to keep her dignity when being insulted. After the conference, a reporter asked her, "Do you think you won?" When the airline changed, when society spoke up, when your father became the leader of reform, Liana replied softly, almost in a whisper, "I don't think this is a victory, because true justice has no winners, only those who learn from their mistakes." She recalled that when she was a child, her father used to tell her, "You can't make the world respect you by shouting. You can only make them listen by living so that they watch." Now, she understood more clearly than ever. One small act, one drop of pride, one moment of silence, all could be the spark of great change, if illuminated with wisdom and compassion. And strangely enough, the events of Flight 909 are not remembered by the world as a scandal, but as an ethical turning point. Aviation training schools, customer service organizations, even technology companies, all began to include Case 909 in their professional ethics curriculum. The video clip of Liana returning to Seat 1A after receiving a public apology became iconic, not because she took revenge, but because she dared to return to her seat, dared to sit in the seat that others had said she did not deserve. She not only reclaimed her seat, but she reclaimed the right to be seen as a human being, not as a black passenger, but as a passenger, commented one psychologist. The story's reach extended beyond the borders of the United States. European airline Air Nordic invited Liana to collaborate on a series of paintings called Above the Clouds for their international lounges. In it, she depicted passengers of all ages and skin colors sitting together under the same sky, where no class is divided by prejudice. Ethan Brooks, her father, looked at the paintings hanging at Oslo Airport and quietly told the reporter, "The day my daughter was kicked out of her seat, I thought I needed to teach the world a lesson, but it turns out she was the one teaching the world." A month later, The Washington Post published a commentary. Justice doesn't need to be grand. It starts with a 17-year-old girl choosing to leave the plane with dignity rather than arguing. And that decision made the entire airline industry and society relearn how to treat people. Liana read the article in silence. She knew that the story was no longer her own. It was a mirror for thousands of people who had been doubted, who had been looked at differently. And the best thing is no one mentions the racism incident anymore. People only mention the lesson of silence. One afternoon, as Liana strolled through the Gallimore Art Gallery, she stopped in front of Runway 8R, where Catherine worked quietly at the end of the hall. They looked at each other, saying nothing. In the dim light, the two women, one had been offended. The other had been the offender, saw the painting reflected between them. Both understood that justice is not about punishment, but about awakening. And sometimes, awakening only requires a sincere look, without fear or shame. Liana left the room, but Catherine remained. She gently wiped the dust off the picture frame, then whispered, "Thank you for letting me live longer, to learn to see people again." Runway 8R is still there, silent and vibrant. Like Liana's story, it's no longer about race, class, or power, but about how people choose to be better after realizing they've been wrong. And then, in a fiery sunset on Atlanta's old runway, father and daughter meet again, where all circles close, revealing the final meaning of the journey called silent justice. The Atlanta sky that afternoon was a shimmering red and gold, just like the colors in Liana's Runway 8R painting. The wind from the runway blew through the metal fence, carrying with it the distant sound of planes taking off, the sound that had been a witness to that fateful day. Now, the area where the Helios Falcon once blocked off has become an outdoor exhibition area called the Horizon Walk, jointly built by the Helios Foundation and the city government. Part of the old runway is still intact, with the white paint still there, like a mark of history. Ethan Brooks stood in the middle, hands in his pockets, a distant gaze. He was slower now, but his eyes were still sharp, the gaze of someone who had once stopped an airport with a single command. In the distance, Liana approached, her hair tied up, her simple white shirt fluttering in the wind. She smiled when she saw her father, a smile both warm and quiet, of someone who had traveled far enough to know that justice needed no noise. "Do you remember this place?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "How could I forget?" "Dad, where you stopped the world. Just for me," she replied, half joking. Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not for you, Liana. I stopped the world so it could see you." They were both silent, looking out at the runway stretching toward the horizon. The setting sun cast two long shadows on the gray asphalt, blending into one. After that day, the lives of each person in the story took a different turn. Andrew Keller, the man who once sat quietly in Chair 2C, is now the executive director of Horizon Scholarship, the scholarship program he founded with Ethan. At 47, he is no longer a cold businessman, but a silver-haired man who travels around schools talking about the power of making the right choice. "I used to think silence was neutral," Andrew said in an interview, "but silence in the face of injustice is being on the wrong side. I can't change the past, but I can help others not repeat it." Catherine Doyle, the woman who had forced Liana to leave her chair, still worked at Gallimore Art Gallery. She did not leave, nor did she ask for forgiveness. She quietly mopped the floor, adjusted the paintings, and sometimes sat alone in the gallery. People said she had written a public apology letter but never sent it, because she realized that words were never enough when the mistake was so deep. Now, every time a customer stopped in front of Runway 8R, she silently looked at them and smiled. The painting was no longer a judgment, but a reminder that people can rise from their own dirt. Atlantic Crown Airways, once infamous for its name, has changed beyond recognition. After being acquired by Helios, they changed their slogan to "Respect Above the Clouds." All employees, from pilots to flight attendants, are given human dignity and service training, inspired by Case 909. No more I classification, no more proving one's eligibility to sit in a purchased seat. Ethan looked toward the end of the runway, where children were running and playing around a bronze plaque that read, "Here, a father stopped the world so it could learn to see his daughter." He chuckled, then turned to Liana. "I used to think I was the one who changed everything. You know. But actually, it was you who changed the world." Liana lowered her head, her voice low and warm. "No, Dad. If you hadn't come that day, I might have left. I might have chosen true silence. You stopped the sky, and I only learned to walk on the ground again." Ethan looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with pride and a hint of sadness. "I only stopped for a day. But you made people look back forever." She smiled, her eyes a warm brown in the sunset. "You know, Dad, justice isn't about bringing people to their knees. It's about them looking up and seeing their own faults." A gentle breeze blew by. Liana opened her bag and took out her old sketchbook, the one she had brought with her on Flight 909 years ago. She flipped to the first page, where she still had a rough sketch of the cabin, Seat 1A, and the faint silhouette of a flight attendant. Beneath it, she added a new line. Justice doesn't roar. It simply stands. Ethan finished reading, put his hand on his daughter's shoulder, and said softly, I think you've finished the last chapter, Liana replied. No, Dad. It's just that I've learned to write it in the light, not the dark. In the distance, the sound of an airplane engine cut through the silence. A new Atlantic Crown jet with a silver livery flew by, its Helios Standard logo reflecting the shimmering sunset. Ethan looked up, his voice tinged with a rare emotion. Back then, Dad's jet blocked the sky. Today, it paved the way for others to fly. Both were silent. Only the sound of the wind and their footsteps echoed evenly on the old asphalt floor. At the end of the runway, Liana stopped and looked back at the faded white line. Dad, she said, her voice soft as a breath. Sometimes, to prove I deserve to sit there, I need a father who stops the world and a daughter who sits back down with pride. Ethan looked at her a long time, his eyes softening. And you did it. Liana, you made justice something that no longer had to be shouted to be heard. Above, the afternoon light slowly faded, leaving a last streak of brilliant orange stretching across the Atlanta sky, where a story ended, not with anger, but with the peace of those who understood that silence can also carry the voice of justice. The story Black Teen was told to get off the plane. Moments later, her black single dad's jet blocks the runway is not only a journey of justice, but also a profound lesson in dignity, wisdom, and unconditional love. Liana, a young girl who was insulted because of her skin color, did not choose anger, did not react with hate, but with calmness and self-respect. It was that moment that made the turning point, when the father, Ethan Brooks, did not use power to retaliate, but to force the world to look at itself. The story reminds us that sometimes the greatest power lies not in the voice, but in commanding silence. It's not who shouts loudest who is right. It's the one who is strong enough to stand firm in the midst of injustice. Each of us, even if we don't own a private jet or have the power of Ethan, can choose to act in ways that make the world around us a better place with respect, compassion, and the courage to say what's right. Justice is not revenge. It is an awakening of consciousness, when people learn to see each other with dignity, not prejudice. If you believe that respect does not require shouting to be heard, please click like, share this story with your loved ones, and subscribe to the channel to help us spread more humane stories, helping us live more deeply, more kindly, and know that, sometimes just by maintaining dignity, we have changed the world.